man is losing at cards. It's February, and it's snowing, and the house he's playing in is not his. He's been sleeping under this roof for 12 nights. He knows which floorboard creaks. He knows the dogs by name. The two young men across the table from him are the sons of the old chief, asleep in the next room, and one of them is married to this man's own niece. So, family. Distantly, awkwardly, by marriage. But family. Someone knocks. A soldier at the door, with a folded piece of paper. The man at the table opens it, and reads it, and I want you to stay with the next 4 seconds, because everything else in this video comes out of them. He folds the paper back up. He puts it inside his coat. He says something about the hour. He wishes the two young men good night, and then he goes upstairs and sleeps in their house, knowing that at 5 o'clock in the morning he is going to kill them both. If your stomach just turned over, that's the Rains of Castamere. June 2013. You probably remember the room you were sitting in, except every single person at that card table was real. The man's name is in the army records. The piece of paper he read that night still exists, and you can go and read it yourself. And the reason the Red Wedding hurts the way it does, the reason it's still the scene people bring up 13 years later, is a rule that Scotland did not invent for a novel. They put it in law, and they had a name for what that man was about to do. Here's what I keep coming back to. Scotland has had worse. Bigger massacres, longer lists, more blood, battles that emptied whole valleys. Almost none of them get remembered outside a textbook. But this one will not go away. 330 years later, there are songs about it, and cairns, and a glen whose name means weeping, and people who will still tell you, with a completely straight face, which surname they won't drink with. So why this one? The answer isn't the body count. The answer is a rule, and the rule has a story, and that story starts 250 years earlier, at a different table, with a boy who was absolutely delighted to be invited. George Martin has said outright where the Red Wedding came from. 2 real events, both Scottish, centuries apart. He combined them and added a wedding. But nobody ever tells them as one story, and they are one story. Watch. Start in 1439, with the luckiest boy in Scotland. William Douglas is 16 years old, and his father has just died, and what William inherits is not a farm. It's Galloway and Annandale and Lauderdale, castles, private armies, hundreds of knights riding under the sign of a bloody red heart. At 16, William Douglas is the most powerful man in the country who isn't a king, and the king is 10. Sit with that arithmetic. A child on the throne, a teenager holding half the South. And in between them, 2 grown men doing the actual governing, a chancellor called Crichton, who holds Edinburgh Castle, and a man called Livingston, who holds Stirling. Neither of them elected, neither of them loved, both of them looking at a 16-year-old with an army and doing the same sum. He isn't an heir, he's a problem. Now William does not know he's a problem. This is the part to hold on to. William thinks he's the future. So when an invitation arrives from Edinburgh Castle, dinner with the young king, a gesture of peace between the crown and his family, of course he goes. Being invited to court by the king is the entire point of being William Douglas. He brings his younger brother David along, who is younger still, and probably thrilled. You already know how you feel watching him ride up that hill. Robb Stark had exactly that face. The 24th of November, 1440. The Great Hall. A 10-year-old king at the head of the table, 2 boys eating well, and the men who invited them watching from the sides of the room.
And here is where this story stops being history and starts being legend.
And I want to be honest with you about the scene, because the scene turns out to be the best part. By the tradition, written down about a century afterwards by chroniclers named Boyce and Mayer, the last dish of the evening comes in covered, on a platter, and it is set down in front of William. And when they lift the cover, it's the head of a black bull. In 15th century Scotland, that image meant one thing only. It meant you are already dead. Then the guards come off the walls. The brothers are seized at the table, dragged out into the courtyard, given something that resembles a trial, and beheaded. Both of them. And in one account the 10-year-old king is screaming at his own guardians to stop, and they ignore him, because he is 10. If you want to know what that looked like from the inside, you've seen it. Catelyn Stark standing in a hall, begging a room that has already decided. Not the same person, the exact same helplessness. Now the honesty. Our best contemporary record of that night is a document called the Auchinleck Chronicle, and it is almost unbearably brief. It notes more or less that the Douglases were beheaded, and it moves on. No platter, no bull, no screaming child. Which means the most famous detail in the whole story, the one that survives 600 years, the one that eventually lands in a fantasy novel, was probably added later by somebody who understood that a death warning served on a dinner plate is a better story than a scuffle in a courtyard. And when George Martin retold it in an interview in 2013, he remembered it as the head of a black boar, not a bull. So follow that chain, one dry line in a chronicle, embellished into legend over a century, half remembered in an interview, turned into the most infamous scene in modern television. We get to watch a story get better at every single step, and nobody along the way was lying. That's just what stories do when human beings carry them. One more thing about that dinner, and it's the coldest detail in the act. The boy's own great-uncle, a Douglas, blood, family, appears to have helped arrange it. He inherited the earldom afterwards. He kept it. He died in his bed. The phrase got river run. And the little boy at the head of the table, the one who couldn't stop it, was paying attention. 12 years go by. A grown king, with a wine-colored birthmark across his face that gets him called the Fiery Face. And he has a Douglas problem again. A new one. Another William, the 8th Earl this time, who is rich, popular, and quietly signing agreements with men the king considers enemies. So James invites him to dinner. And here's what makes the next 4 minutes the darkest stretch of this whole story. James is more careful than his guardians were. He is better at this than they were. He has learned. He doesn't just send a friendly note. He sends a safe conduct. A formal, written, sealed royal guarantee that William Douglas will walk into Stirling Castle and walk back out of it again. That's bread and salt with a wax seal on it. That's the promise, in writing, with the king's own name at the bottom. The 22nd of February, 1452. William comes, they eat, they talk. James asks him to break off his alliances. William refuses. And the King of Scotland pulls a knife and stabs his own guest in the neck. More than 20 times, in the neck and the shoulder, according to the Chronicle. Then a courtier called Patrick Gray steps in and finishes him with a poleaxe. Then they put the body out of the window, into the garden below. 4 months later, Parliament formally clears the king of any intention to kill him. Now, you have been waiting for this, and Scotland delivered it 3 centuries before television did. Because when the Douglases came for Stirling, and they came, they brought something with them. They rode into that town with the king's letter of safe conduct, that sealed royal promise, pinned to a horse's tail, dragged through the mud, in front of everybody, so that every single person in Stirling could see precisely what the word of a steward was worth. The North remembers, Scotland got there first. But look at what has actually happened here. Twice in 12 years, at the very top of the kingdom, men have been killed under invitation, and nobody has hanged for it. And that is a problem. Not a moral problem, a practical one. Because a country where you cannot safely accept dinner is a country that stops working. So Scotland did something about it. Scotland reached for the law. Hold that thought for 240 years. 1692. Different world. Muskets now, uniforms, a Dutch king on the British throne, and a glen in the west called Glencoe. And the man at the center of it is not who you'd expect. If I say Highland chief, you're probably picturing something wild. Alistair MacDonald of Glencoe, Macian, they called him, was in his 70s. And for the last weeks of his life he was essentially an old man trying to file paperwork correctly. Here's the situation. The government wants every clan chief to swear an oath of loyalty to King William, and the deadline is the 1st of January. Miss it, and you are legally a rebel. Simple enough. Except Macian and the others consider themselves already bound by an oath to the old king, the one across the water in France. And that king doesn't release them from it until the middle of December. And the news doesn't reach Glencoe until the 28th. 3 days, in a Highland winter. Macian goes anyway. Old man, deep snow, he reaches Fort William. And there is nobody there with the authority to take his oath. So they sent him on. Inverary, 60 miles further, through a blizzard. He swears the oath on the 6th, 6 days late. And then he goes home to his family. And he believes it's finished. He believes he did the thing. He tells his people they are safe. Now let's do the thing your favorite channels do. Let's run it the other way. What if Macian had made the deadline? What if the messenger had ridden faster, or the snow had been lighter, or the clerk at Fort William had been slightly more helpful? What if that old man had signed on the 31st of December, in perfect order, with time to spare? Because the decision to make an example of the MacDonalds of Glencoe had already been taken by a politician in Edinburgh named John Dalrymple, who had been hunting for a pretext and needed one from somebody small enough to have no powerful friends. 6 days late wasn't the trigger. 6 days late was the excuse he'd been waiting for. Robb Stark broke a marriage pact. Macian missed a deadline in the snow. In both stories, the offense is real. In both stories, the offense is not the reason. And in both stories, the man who orders it never has to be in the room. Dalrymple wrote about rooting the clan out as though it were an act of charity, a kindness really, to the Highlands. He had never seen the Glen. He never would. That is Tywin Lannister doing arithmetic in King's Landing, 400 miles from the blood, calling it mercy because fewer people die on paper. On the 1st of February, 120 soldiers came up the Glen and asked if they could stay. They said the fort was full. That was all. Routine. 120 men of the Earl of Argyle's regiment needing beds in a country where there were no inns. And here is the thing about the Highlands in 1692 that makes everything after this possible. There was no hotel. There was no next village down the road. If you were caught out in a Highland winter and the stranger's door did not open, you died. Everybody knew it, because everybody was, sooner or later, the stranger. So hospitality in that world is not manners. It's infrastructure. It's the only thing standing between a traveler and a ditch. Which is why in the Gaelic world it sat very close to sacred, and why a household that took you in became responsible for you the whole time you were under that roof. The MacDonalds opened their doors, and then 12 days happened, and I need you to feel all 12 of them. The soldiers move into the houses. Not a camp outside. The houses. They eat at the family tables. They sleep by the family fires. A lot of them are Highlanders themselves, so they can talk. They drink. They gamble. There's dancing. There are children who stop being frightened of them by about day 3 and start following them around by about day 6. Their commander is a 60-year-old captain named Robert Campbell of Glenlyon. He's broke. He drinks. He's carrying gambling debts, which is roughly why a man his age is still taking army commissions at all. And he is quartered in the chief's own house, and that is not chance, because Glenlyon is related to these people. His niece is married to Macian's younger son. Every morning for 2 weeks, he walks over to that young couple's home and has a drink with them. You have watched this. You have watched a trusted man with a family connection sit at his host's table and be perfectly pleasant company. Glenlyon wore it for 12 days. The 12th of February. Evening. Glenlyon is playing cards with Macian's sons, and a soldier comes to the door with a folded piece of paper. The orders are signed by a major named Duncanson, and they are the coldest document in this story, so I'll let them speak for themselves. Fall upon the rebels, the MacDonalds of Glencoe, and put all to the sword under 70. Take special care that the old fox and his sons do not escape your hands. 5 o'clock precisely. And if I am not with you by 5, do not wait for me. Fall on. Cut off, the letter says. Root and branch. Glenlyon reads it. Says good night to the sons of the man he has been drinking with for a fortnight. And at 5 in the morning, in the dark, in the snow, the guests turned on their hosts. Now, the reveal this entire video has been holding back. Because when word of Glencoe got out, Scotland did not react the way you react to a battle, or even the way you react to a massacre. Scotland reacted the way you react to something that already has a name. Under Scots law, there was a specific, separate category of killing, and it was held to be more monstrous than ordinary murder. Not because of how many died, not because of how, because of the betrayal involved. To kill a man who had accepted your hospitality, or whose hospitality you had accepted, was its own distinct offense, and it was worse. They called it murder under trust. Guest right is not a fantasy rule, it's a statute. There was a legal term for what Robert Campbell of Glenlyon did before he did it. He would have grown up knowing that term, and he did it anyway. 33 or 34 men were killed outright that morning, and 4 women. Macian was shot as he got out of his bed, and the rest of the glen ran up into the mountains in a blizzard in February. How many died out there, nobody actually knows. The traditional figure is another 40. It's repeated everywhere. It has never been verified, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. One correction, and it matters more than it looks. This is remembered as Campbell revenge. The Campbells slaughtering the MacDonalds, an ancient clan feud finally going too far. That version got polished up by romantic historians in the 1800s, and it is still what almost everybody repeats, including, very gently, George Martin himself. Of the 120 soldiers standing in that glen, only about a dozen were Campbells. This was not a feud. This was a government operation, ordered from a desk in Edinburgh, carried out by a regular army regiment, following written orders. Which is colder, and worse, and much more modern than a feud. But 120 armed men were sleeping in those houses. Several hundred people lived in that glen. 38 died. So where did everybody go? Here's what the people of Glencoe said, and kept saying, for the next 150 years. They said that on the afternoon before, one of the soldiers went out walking with a local man, and stopped beside a big boulder in a field, and spoke, not to the man, to the stone. He said something like this: "Great stone of the glen, you have every right to be where you are. But if you knew what was coming tonight, you would not stay there for anything." And the man standing beside him understood exactly what he was being told, and couldn't save many. They said that Glenlyon's own piper climbed up onto that same stone at dusk, and played a lament called "Women of the Glen." A tune the valley knew, a tune that means something terrible is coming, and played it loud enough to carry. They said a soldier told a dog in front of its owners that it would be very wise to go and sleep out in the heather tonight. Now, are those stories true? Some of them almost certainly aren't. Not as told. Historians have pushed back hard on the piper, because playing an unordered tune would have got him punished, and a punishment like that would sit in a record somewhere. But the historian John Preble makes the point that actually matters, and it's the one I want to leave with you. The men in that regiment were Highlanders too. Murder under trust was as monstrous to them as it was to anybody else in that country. And the confused, contradictory, multiplying stories the Glen told for a century and a half afterwards preserve something true, which is that some of those soldiers were sickened by their orders, and tried, inside the limits of an oath they could not break, to warn the people they had been eating with. And then there's the arithmetic, which isn't folklore at all. 120 armed men, billeted inside the houses, total surprise, against a population of several hundred, and 38 dead. The blocking party sent to seal both ends of the glen arrived late. Doors that should have been watched weren't watched. By its own standards, the operation failed. It failed because human beings sabotaged it. And before we go, I want to point at one thing, because it is the most beautiful inversion in this entire story. In the show, the music is the signal. The band starts playing, and you know the killing has begun. In Glencoe, the music was somebody trying to stop it. 3 years later, in 1695, a Scottish parliamentary commission looked into all of it, and wrote a sentence that stopped me cold when I read it. However absolute the command of a superior officer may be, they said, no command against the laws of nature is binding, and a soldier ought to refuse to carry out a barbarity. That is Nuremberg. 250 years early, written in a room in Edinburgh, about a glen in the west. So what happened to everybody? The commission named it murder under trust. It named John Dalrymple. It recommended he be prosecuted. He never was. He resigned, waited it out, came back, and eventually died an earl. There's a story in Scotland that his family crest is the reason the 9 of Diamonds is called the Curse of Scotland. Glenlyon was shipped off to Flanders and died broke. No Frey pies, nobody's throat opened at a wedding years later. And that is the part of the true story that's harder to sit with than the fiction. Because the fiction pays you back. And Scotland simply didn't. And then, this. In August of 2023, a University of Glasgow archaeology student on her very first dig was working on a house in Glencoe, associated with Macian. And she lifted a hearthstone. Underneath it was a small pot, with a rounded pebble balanced on top of it for a lid. Inside the pot were 36 coins, silver and bronze, English, Scottish, French, Elizabeth, the Cromwell years, Charles. Nothing minted after the 1680s. They were put there for safekeeping, and nobody ever came back for them. Think about what that actually is. They had a minute, maybe two, and with that minute they chose to hide the money under the fireplace. Because you only hide the money if you believe you're coming home. 331 years later, an undergraduate found it, still waiting. That's why this one won't die. Not the body count. Scotland has worse. It's that a whole country looked at a man who ate at your table and then killed you, and decided there needed to be a name for that. A name worse than murder. And then watched a king do it. And then watched a government do it. And never once managed to punish anybody for it. So it did the only thing it had left. It remembered. In songs, in stones, in the names of glens, in what a stranger will still tell you in a pub, 300 years on. George Martin didn't invent guessed right. He found it, lying in Scottish history exactly where it had been left, still sharp. And the next time you watch that scene, when the doors close and the music starts, I think you'll hear it a little differently. Because somewhere in that hall, there's a man who knows the word for what he's doing. This has been Real Roots, the real history behind the stories you love. Next time, the 30-year civil war between two royal families that gave us the Starks and the Lannisters, right down to the names.